Good afternoon.
What's up?
Howdy.
Hello.
I just started the process of getting a wall knocked down in my house.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah, it's cool. It was cool because I was like, oh, this isn't load bearing because I'm an expert on homes. And then my contractor was like, yeah, it's not load bearing. And then he went to go take it down and it was load bearing. So
Did you find out with half the roof collapse?
no, luckily he just knocked a hole in and saw something that was like a dead giveaway. And I was like, well, we've already started. So
it's real life refactoring.
So a little less banter today. I want to go ahead and jump in. We're joined by Jonathan, and I will throw it over to him for a quick introduction.
Yeah, hi, it's Jonathan Reinink, and how to introduce myself on a Rails podcast. I'm a Laravel developer. I've never written any Ruby and never worked with Rails. I think I installed it on my laptop once. That's as far as I've gotten. But as I was saying to the guys before we started this, I feel like I know and am familiar with Rails, even though I've never worked with it because I've listened to so many podcasts over the years from developers who work with Rails every day. So I kind of know it from that side of things. And I'm primarily a PHP developer. I work with Laravel, the Laravel framework, which I feel has like a lot of similarities to Rails. It's kind of a sort of a sister framework from a different language. And my main open source contributions have been the Tailwind CSS framework. I wrote that originally with Adam Wethen, kind of helped him out on that project early on. And kind of in the last year or so, I've moved on to a new project of mine called Inertia.js, which is it's basically a way to create single page apps, building them kind of in the more standard classic monolith sort of approach to building web apps.
Yeah, anyone who listens to the show is no stranger to a Laravel, because for a Rails podcast, we actually talk about that more than maybe we should. And then we've talked about Tailwind so many times. Let's actually just jump in. I'd like to, get into Inertia. I think we're all really interested to talk about that. But so Tailwind, I would be kind of interested to know how you got involved with that with Adam, starting off.
Yeah. So good question. I kind of joke that in a way that I'm the co-author of it, because in a way I am, because me and him spent a lot of time originally working on it and creating it together, but it's really Adam's brainchild. And so what happened, it was probably I think it's going on 2 years ago now. Me and Adam talk all the time, and we kind of pair program all the time, just helping each other out with different problems. And I was working on my SaaS application, and he was working on a project at the time, and we sort of had a difference of opinion about how to style our applications. And I had been doing marketing sites and front-end development for many years. I worked at an agency for 10 years doing basically marketing sites. And the approach that I had landed on was the BEM style approach to organizing CSS and styling a site. And Adam said, hey, John, I've been doing this other thing, and I basically use all these tiny little utility classes, and I kind of patch them all together, and then I build up my design in that way. And I basically laughed at him and said, there's no way that would work. That's going to be way too limiting. You're going to need like a million different utilities to actually get anywhere. It's going to make your markup all messy and everything else. But he was pretty adamant that this was a cool approach. So he convinced me to give it a try. And at the time I was redesigning my own SaaS app. So I decided to give it a try. And I think the reason I decided to give it a try is because I was a little bit frustrated kind of with that BEM style approach. So I just said, why not? I'll give this a try. And I think it was like within a day, I was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. So we basically had this really, really rough bunch of files that Adam had written that we were kind of sharing between the two of us for a few months, kind of as I built my project out. We ended up creating a repo just so that when we both made changes, it would kind of get saved into one spot. And I remember at the time, we said to each other, we should really package this up into a framework. And we basically said to ourselves, like, we're going to do this. And literally, like, if nobody else in the world uses it, it doesn't matter, because we've been enjoying working with this so much. We're just gonna create it for ourselves. Which, by the way, I think is always an awesome way to build any sort of software or open source library or anything. Always to have kind of this attitude that you're gonna build it for yourselves to scratch your own itch. I think is always smart, because I think the second you start trying to create something, trying to predict other people's wants and needs, you end up kind of watering down your library and kind of actually taking away sort of some of the interesting pieces that you'd have if you just built it in a super opinionated way that you like. Anyway, so we did that. And then I think we ended up working on it. So that was in and around March or April of, I think, and the years are getting lost on me. I almost want to say it was 2017, and we worked on it together for six to 8 months, I think. And then we launched it kind of publicly, and fully expecting people to kind of just totally hate it, right? Because it's just this totally different way of building, websites and designing websites. And but then, to our surprise, it became really, really popular, and it was kind of slow at first, but now it's crazy. It's become kind of taken on a life form of itself. It's pretty neat, and Adam's basically working on it full time now, which is super, super cool. So yeah, I did most of my contributions kind of early on, kind of me and him building the initial version. We had endless discussions about how to name utilities and just ridiculously long like discussions. We'd spend a whole afternoon trying to name one utility, like literally, and then the next day we'd throw it out and start over. So it was a fun project, and yeah, that was kind of my involvement in it.
That's really cool. Being involved in something very early on and then like seeing yourself out is like me and Chris. Like every project, I always start with Chris, and then I'm like, all right, you got this. And Chris just takes over and rolls with it. Unlike me, though, you've actually gone to do another very just massive undertaking of an open source project, and that's Inertia.js. And we would love to kind of hear, maybe for those who are listening, like what it is, and B, how you ended up here.
Yeah. Okay. So where to start on this? So I'm going to kind of like back it up a little bit to kind of let you know how I even came up with the idea. And I think as Rails developers, you'll be able to connect with this. Definitely be able to connect with this. So Laravel is the same as Rails in that you have routes and you have controllers and you have views, right? And Laravel views are blade views. Rails, I guess they're ERB templates. Am I saying that right?
Yep.
And so you basically build your app that way. All your HTML, all your markup goes in your templates or your views. And that's kind of like the classic server-side monolith approach, right? Laravel early on, though, kind of early on in really kind of what made the framework was its tight integration with this up-and-coming JavaScript framework at the time, now well-known, and that is Vue.js. And so Taylor and another gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Way, who runs Laracasts, they both really connected with this JavaScript framework. So it kind of was like the JavaScript framework that gets installed with Laravel kind of like by default. And the nice thing about Vue is that you can drop it in, like you can create Vue components and you can drop those components just into your regular server-side rendered templates. and they'll work really nicely. So you don't have to go all in on Vue. You can literally say, well, I'm going to have my 95% of my page rendered server side with Blade and Laravel, but then there's going to be these few components within it where you need some interactivity that are Vue components that, maybe for a drop down or some sort of form or whatever. So that's the way I was building my websites, or my apps, I should say, because that's mostly what I've been doing the last number of years. And that was fine. But what I found was happening, because I'm building web apps, and I think this would be different if you were building, say, public marketing sites or public facing sites. But because I was building web apps which are made of a lot of forms and a lot of inputs, different inputs and controls and all this sort of stuff, I found myself reaching for Vue more and more, just to do all kinds of different things, drop downs, forms, file uploads, all kinds of stuff. And I started getting frustrated because what I found was half of my application was now in Vue components and half of my application was in Blade templates. And I really hated the context switching between the two. That was so just the fact that my templates were essentially broken up into two different types of languages, you could say, and in two different places, it always was kind of like this annoying switch back and forth. But that wasn't the only annoying thing. The another annoying thing was if you've ever experienced this, if you've ever used Vue, you'll know that when the page loads and all those Vue components boot up, you end up with this flicker, right? Because the server-side stuff renders immediately, right, when the browser spits it out. But all the Vue components have to have that split second where they get booted up by Vue. And that split second causes a little flicker. And if it's for a little thing like a button or something, it's not a big deal. But kind of the more of these you add to your site, kind of the more annoying and distracting this gets, especially when they impact the document flow. So it's one thing if something just pops in after the fact, but if it pops in and then other things shift around, it's just not a visually pleasing thing to have happen. And it really bugs me. I hate the flicker. So I started thinking about how I would solve that. And kind of the one simple solution is to basically cloak your entire website. So what you basically do is because you have to wait for Vue either way, there's this thing called cloaking with Vue where you essentially hide your entire page. And then when Vue finally runs and those components are initialized, then the cloaking gets basically removed or whatever, and the whole page displays. But now essentially what you've done is the server side rendering is you're not even getting the benefits of that because you're literally hiding the server side content until Vue's booted up. So, and that still doesn't take care of the whole, the two different contexts and the two different types of files, Vue files. So I started thinking about that, and what I ended up doing what I started noticing is that more and more of my pages were starting to turn into Vue components, and sometimes you have it where you end up just taking the entire page, which started as a mix of server-side template and some Vue components, and for whatever reason those components needed to work together. And they needed, one component does something and has to change something on another part of the page. And you end up kind of just saying, okay, I'm going to wrap this up into just one bigger component that has kind of all the content. So what I ended up having is I had these templates in Laravel, which would literally be nothing in the entire template other than just the Vue, whatever the Vue component was. So I kind of thought to myself, well, this is really odd. I have these server-side templates that have a single Vue component being rendered in it, and that's it. And it kind of really made me think, well, you know what, maybe in these situations I don't need the Vue template at all. Maybe I can just get rid of it. Sorry, I gotta be careful with my terms here because I'm talking about Vue, the actual JavaScript framework, and I'm talking about views as in the server-side templates. So when I didn't need the Vue at all, what I meant is I realized I didn't need the server-side template anymore at all. I could potentially just say right from my controller method, instead of defining a server-side Blade template, I could just define my component. So basically I created this little thing in Laravel where I could do that. And I basically had one standard component blade template, or you could call it like an ERB template, like just one template that I could pass any component to, so any component name to, and any component props, and it would basically spit out that view component and give it its initial props, and it would display the view component without me having to create any server side template for that particular page. Is that making sense so far?
Oh yeah. This is really interesting to me because I don't know. It was a while back when I was playing with Vue, and I went through the same exact process of like, okay, I'll use Vue for like one form or something that's complicated, and I'll use my, server side templates for everything else. And yeah, Rails makes it a little bit more it's a little interesting because Rails comes with turbo links by default, which has basically intercepts all your link clicks and then caches the page right before it leaves the page. Yep. So anyone who was using Vue with turbo links ended up like it would cache the HTML that Vue rendered, which wouldn't actually be able to be remounted next time you came back. And I ended up building a Vue turbo links library that just hooks into Vue and says, hey, before we leave the page, let's just tear down Vue and replace it with the original HTML so that next time you come back here, it can mount again. And that emphasizes the flicker a whole lot,
Yep.
And that was certainly the same thing of like, okay, well now I have a view like this form, and it literally just renders like one view template or one view component and passes in like the object as props. And now I don't need anything else, server side. So yeah, I went through that whole thing. It's kind of funny. And the only solution for that TurboLinks thing was like, you could kind of cheat if you were very deliberate, where you would say, here, let's put an ID on the page for this new form. And as long as our parent view component had the same ID in it, then TurboLinks could like remount it. But if it wasn't,
interesting.
Yeah, and it works and it helps a little bit, but you still end up with a situation of like, well, it rendered the cached version of it, then the whole thing just kind of flickers away and gets reset with the newly mounted version of it. So it was a little bit better, but not great. So Inertia has been like really interesting for me because I'm like, man, I really need to start moving stuff over to that because it was like I don't know, it's just a frustrating experience if you're trying to, you don't necessarily want to go the full single page app route, but at the same time, like you have to if you do that, you have to duplicate all your routes and everything. So I think Inertia is like extremely interesting.
Yeah,
for that
cool.
reason.
Cool. So let me. So this is interesting. So one, on my own personal solo SaaS business that I run, that basically that's my primary source of revenue. One of my dependencies on that project is Vue TurboLinks. I literally use your proprietary library,
That's
and
awesome.
that's because so and TurboLinks plays an important role kind of in all this. So I'll continue along the story here and I'll show you how that plays into this whole process, because I often I don't think I say it anymore on the website, although it wouldn't surprise me if it's somewhere. But like Inertia was very TurboLinks inspired, and I've been using TurboLinks for years. So I kind of had these. So and I did use it that way. So my applications that have like this mix of server side render templates and this mix of client side components, these Vue components, I also use TurboLinks to get that SPA feel. But I had the exact same problem with the whole issue with the way TurboLinks really not agreeing with Vue all that much. So I use your library, and that sort of, I would call it like a bit of a stopgap, but it's definitely not a perfect solution because essentially what you're doing is you're not reloading the page, but you're still going out of your way to destroy Vue, the Vue instance every single time, which is like really not like the most efficient way of handling things.
Yeah, like
So yeah,
it works, but it's not. It's just like, okay, this is the easiest thing you can get to make it compatible, but it's not like
yeah,
a smooth experience in any sort of fashion.
exactly. So, so I created that. I created basically that server side template that would load my single view component and pass in the props. And I wrote a whole blog post about this and about how, you know what, just throw away your server side render templates, assuming you don't need like SEO and all that stuff, right? That's kind of like the underlying. I should just say right away, like Inertia is a client side rendered template. Like it works for client side rendered views, right? So if SEO is important to you, then Inertia is not likely the solution for you. Okay. But so I said, if you want to build your applications using Vue or using a JavaScript framework, which I personally do, not that like I really, really love server side rendered templates for all the simplicity and wonderful, just how easy they are. I love that. But I also just from having built a piece of software now for my own piece of software and other pieces of software for a decade now, my own piece of software, I've really just come to the point that I want JavaScript. I just do, and I love Vue.js. I've worked with React. I like React as well, but personally, I think I prefer Vue.js just because I love the templates. The templates just work well for my own mental model. And I just really like being able to build a page and then add in functionality whenever I need. And what I was having is I'd be like, okay, I want to add some new piece of functionality to my app, right? And I would go and look, and that particular page would be a blade template, and I'd be like, oh nuts. I'm like, now I want to just do the simple thing that I know would take me literally 2 seconds in Vue. And now it's this big, annoying, complicated thing. I got to make the decision like, okay, do I want to just try to like drop in a Vue component here and make a new Vue component? Just the fact that I'd have to make a new, like just create a new file drove me nuts. Like I just want to do a simple thing. Or I'd have to say, okay, well, do I just want to like take this whole blade template and convert it entirely right away to a Vue component? But that would take time, right? Not that like, and that's what I did a lot of the times. But it was just it just made simple changes more difficult. The second I needed any little bit of like functionalities, any sort of like client side interactivity, I was faced with these annoying questions like, oh, how do I handle this? So going all in on Vue.js page components was just like so freeing. It's like, okay, now everything's just a Vue component. It's like, yeah, I'm now dealing with like, okay, all this JavaScript needs to be shipped to the browser, and there's a cost to that. But for me, it was worth that cost. So I did that, put a whole blog post out about it. And at the end of that blog post, I even said, oh, and by the way, you can actually enable SPA mode here by installing turbo links. Be aware there's this gotcha, be aware there's that gotcha, and the whole thing we just spoke about. So then I was thinking one day, and I said, I was actually talking to, again, Adam Wethen, and I said to him, I feel like I'm all the way to this point. I'm like, I almost feel like I need to create what I called that day. I think I called it like Turbo View. That was my little joking beta name for this project. Turbo View, which is basically turbo links, but optimized for Vue. And my thinking at that time was, instead of making on the subsequent page requests, instead of returning a full HTML response like you would do with turbo links and then having turbo links parse out the body and everything else, right? Instead of doing that, I said, well, what if instead of that, when you made that subsequent page visit, you make it as an AJAX visit, just like TurboLinks does. But on the server side, what if it was smart? And instead of returning the full HTML back, what if it only returned two things? One, the name of the new Vue page component that you're going to be visiting, and two, any props that are required for that page, and return all that just as JSON. And then client side, the way that quote unquote Turbo View could work is it could say, it would just say, okay, well, here's a new page name, page component name, and here's the new props. I'm just going to swap it out. So a key thing to mention here is frameworks like Vue.js and React and Svelte, they all have this concept of, I forget what the exact name of it is, but it's basically the idea of dynamic components, meaning you can literally just take an existing Vue instance and dynamically swap out whatever the component is rendered at that time and provide new props. So that's kind of like the key piece to all of Inertia. The fact that all these server-side frameworks support dynamic components. Okay. So I'm like, I bet I can do that. That actually, what I didn't realize at the time is that was like, I was wondering, like, can I do that? And what I realized really, really quickly, like within, I think, an hour of suggesting that to Adam, I had a working prototype. And what I realized then is that wasn't the hard part of this whole project. The hard part of this whole project was handling all the client-side, basically the client-side routing. Now, Inertia doesn't do client-side routing, but it kind of does, and we can get more into that. But anyway, so that worked, and I was like, man, this is awesome. I removed turbo links entirely. I added this really simple, basically anytime you clicked a link on the page, it would intercept that link and it would say, okay, you're looking to go to /about, hit the /about page on the server. So it actually makes an XHR request there. The server says, and then when it makes that XHR request, this is like the secret sauce to this. It passes through an X inertia header, basically just a header that says X inertia true. It's just an identifier to say this is an inertia request. The server sees that, and instead of returning the full HTML response back, it just says, well, I know that all you're looking for is the page component name and the JSON that's required. And what's cool is within the actual controller, it's not like you're saying, well, if this is an inertia request, return this. And if it's like a regular HTML request, return this. There's basically an abstraction over it that handles that automatically for you. So in your controller, you basically just say, okay, return the page component name and return the data, the props, and Inertia and kind of the server side and the client side Inertia libraries sort of figure out how to handle all of that. So that was kind of the day Inertia was born, and I was like, this is awesome. And what's the really, really cool thing here is that you don't have to destroy your current client side Vue or React instance. It stays alive, which comes with all sorts of other interesting SPA advantages. And it was really it was really neat because kind of at first I'm like, this is awesome. But then kind of over the next 6 months to a year, I kind of started using this and exploring. Like, you kind of don't know at first with new technology, sort of how far you can go with it and kind of like what's all possible. But then as I messed around with it more and more, I kind of learned new tricks and different things that were possible with it. Like, for instance, at first, Inertia only worked on GET requests. So only when you made GET requests. It didn't work at all with POST requests or put or patch or delete or whatever. And then I realized once, and I'm like, because in my mind, it was like TurboLinks, and TurboLinks only does GET requests. And I'm like, I'm not even going to try to figure that out. But then I realized, I was out for a walk one day. I'm like, you know what? This would totally work. It's like if you submit a form and do a post, you can literally just submit that as an Inertia request, as a post request, makes the XHR request to the server. The server, again, just does whatever it's going to do. So maybe it's going to create something, right? And then it's going to do something. It's going to return some validation errors, or it's going to say success, and it's going to say redirect somewhere. So maybe you're creating a user, and you're on the create user page, and it successfully creates a user, and then it redirects you back to, say, the user index page. And this was like, my brain exploded when I realized how this would work, because what happens is from your form, you submit that request, that Inertia request. So you submit the form, it goes, it creates the user, and then server side, it does a redirect to another page, wherever in the app, just like a normal classic monolith server side rendered app would make a redirect after, right? So it makes a redirect back to wherever you want to redirect to. But then when it hits that endpoint, that X Inertia header is actually it's transferred during the redirect. So when it hits whatever page, so you end up back, so the XHR request is made, and you end up back on the index page for your users, it says, well, this is still an inertia request. So instead of returning HTML, it actually returns the JSON version of it. So it gives you the page component name and it gives you the props. And then client side, it comes back and it says, oh, the page components changed and the props have changed. So it swaps that out. So you go from being on the create page to now to be on the edit page. And then it also updates the URL. And that's kind of the whole client side routing thing. But it updates the URL based on whatever it happened to end up on the client side, so or on the server side. So if it ended up back on the user page or on the user index page, well then it returns. I should say when the JSON response that comes back from the server, it includes the page component name and it includes the page data or the props, right? It also includes whatever the current URL is. So that's how Inertia knows what to update client side, like the push state, it knows based on that. So this is really kind of how Inertia came to be, and that to me was such a neat discovery, because what it meant is I can really build an app just like I would really with like classic Rails or classic Laravel, where I just have different endpoints and I redirect between them. I don't have to go out of my way to like package up. I don't have to go out of my way to send an XHR request to create a user and then like get the JSON back from that and like manually inspect the response that came back in that JSON payload and then figure out what to do from there. Like Inertia just handles it all automatically.
Oh, you guys track? Really cool. Yeah. Yeah, because see, it's interesting. Like Rails came with turbo links, and like it also did only GET requests, and still to this day. But it sounds like in May they're releasing like a newer version that will handle things like forms, because it's really funny that what they did with TurboLinks is like the Rails integration. When you hit the server with a TurboLinks request, it will replace the like a redirect. Instead of just doing a browser redirect, it returns JavaScript that says, hey, just tell TurboLinks to go to this URL, and it handles those like that. But they have zero support for form submissions, which means that like you can't really handle the entire application like that. And that was one of the problems that they tried to build mobile adapters so you could embed your website in your mobile app, but those adapters were built to disable form submits because that would require you to like re-download all your CSS and JavaScript in the middle of your mobile app, which would be really strange and slow. And they never had a solution for that, which I always found kind of strange. But like even without all that, this makes it really, really nice to just be able to say, in a way, you're like, we don't need to build a special API to have our Vue app get some JSON back and handle all this stuff. We just have it say, hey, render this component just like we're normally used to, and it just works, which is really cool. So like kind of simplifies, building it's not, I don't know what you call it, but it's not like a full single page app, and it's like a hybrid between the two. It's interesting.
Yep. Yeah, and it definitely is a hybrid between the two, but I would say that it feels way, way more like a classic Rails or Laravel app. So even though it is a hybrid, it feels very, very much like what you've been used to building, which is, I think, one of the reasons it's become so popular, because I think a lot of server-side, developers, people who haven't done a ton of work with APIs or full classic SPAs, they basically start using Inertia, and it's kind of just works like kind of the way they would be used to, just kind of really, really quickly they can get up and running. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, I think, having been someone who's mostly server side for quite some time, it just ends up that you're like, you get frustrated at a point because you can't add some, complex functionality on the front end that you need to do, and then you're like, well, if I reach for view and view turbo links, then the UI starts to get clunky, and then the more we use that, the more clunky everything gets, and it just, you end up going down the rabbit hole. And then if you go the single page app route, it's a whole different rabbit hole, and it's not, it's just not as good as people have to make it out to be. So I love this approach because it's almost as server side focused as you could make it without giving up view or something.
Yeah, and I always say, like, I don't necessarily pitch Inertia as the alternative. Like, I guess it is an alternative to building. It definitely is an alternative to building a. Sorry, I shouldn't say that I don't pitch it as an alternative, because I do pitch it as exactly that. What I meant to say is I don't pitch it as the only way to build things. I don't think Inertia is the only way you can build apps nowadays, and I don't think that now that I created this, you shouldn't ever create a classic SPA that has a full API or like a GraphQL API and all the client side state management stuff and offline mode and all that sort of stuff. I'm not saying, like, I think those apps absolutely have their place, especially when you need an API anyway, say for native apps or whatever. So I still think that that whole architectural pattern has its place. But what I was really targeting with Inertia was all the people who had already made the decision to build a server-side rendered application, who'd already accepted the fact that they weren't going to build an API anyway, that they were totally okay with not building an API, except they wanted the SPA experience still, right? So I think people think, well, if you use Inertia, you now don't have an API, and if you don't have an API, well, now if you want to build mobile, iOS and Android apps, you're euchred. And I'm saying no. It's like you had already made that decision if you were planning on building it as a classic Rails or a classic Laravel app anyway. So what it does is it really, really just totally lowers the barrier to entry to building these kind of apps, like an SPA feeling app, web app. It makes it so much more approachable than before. Because before, and I kind of explained this in the docs, and I explained it on when I've talked about it in my blog posts on Twitter and whatnot. Before, it's like, okay, I have a server-side rendered app that has a bunch of Vue components, but I'm like, I really want like the SPA experience. And if you go and ask on Reddit or on Stack Overflow or wherever, like, well, how do I make this an SPA? The answer immediately is you need to build an API. You need to separate your server side or your back end from your front end entirely. Go host your back end on Heroku and put your front end app on Netlify or something. Like, it's just this massive paradigm shift, which, again, like that whole architectural pattern's not wrong in and of itself. It has its place, of course. But it's like, if I just have a simple web app and I just want to make it more like an SPA and have that rich client side feel, to be told you got to completely rethink your entire architecture it's a real bummer. And that's where I think Inertia is just such a cool in-between solution. I've kind of joked that it's kind of like a bit of a gateway drug to building SPAs.
It's definitely really cool. One question I have about it, since you're dealing a lot like with the server still, authentication can still happen on the server, right? You don't need any kind of hoops to jump through. I guess with that, you could do like session-based auth. Is that right?
Absolutely. I love session-based auth. It's the simplest way of handling auth ever, especially since it's like baked into Laravel, and I'm assuming Rails kind of just, it's part of the framework. So getting session auth up and running just like literally just works with Inertia. It's just, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to think about JWT tokens. You don't need to think about OAuth. And you don't got to think about all that crap. It basically just works. So like, if we take my example that I was talking about earlier, right? So imagine we're on like the create user page and you submit that form, which would, if it was successful, it would go and redirect back to the user page, right? But let's imagine you submit that form and you your session expired, right? So you're essentially logged out. What's going to happen is you're going to submit that form using Inertia. So it'd be like inertia.post. And it's going to go to your server, that request. And the server is going to hit the middleware and do the auth authentication. And it's going to, oh no, this user's not logged out anymore. But it's not going to like die there and give you whatever the unauthenticated error code is. It's actually getting like you would expect with a regular server-side rendered application, which would do a redirect to show you the login page. It does that, except it does that redirect in the Inertia XHR request. So it's going to hit the post endpoint to create the user. It's going to hit the middleware, realize it's not authenticated anymore. The user needs to log back in. It's going to redirect to the login page. And then the client side is going to say, hey, I got to show the login page component now. And it feels exactly like a classic server-side rendered app in that sense. Suddenly you'll be like, oh, I got logged out. I guess I have to log back in. And it even like remembers like intended URLs and all that stuff. So if it like logs you out because you try to go to an endpoint in your app and you're not logged in, it'll redirect you back to your login page. You'll log in, and then when you log in, it'll go to whatever your intended URL is. At least that's how it works in Laravel. It just works. I suspect it probably does the same in Rails.
Yeah, I was just thinking how that would work with Devise. I would think it would just function the same, wouldn't you, Chris?
Yeah, I think so, because I think it stores that URL that you were previously going to, and you can store it in a cookie or whatever. But yeah, I would imagine it would work. And if not, it would be very easy to go add that back in.
Yeah, we're not blessed with a one true authentication package in Rails.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Everyone uses like the same package for the most part. It's called Devise, and it was made by Platformatech, and which no longer works with it. But everyone uses it, and it just like scaffolds out auth for you. But it's not part of Rails. Like that's one thing. Excuse me, Chris and I always talk about is like the lowest like thing when we look at Laravel, like we're jealous of. It's like, oh, authentication and users are just built in.
Yeah, it works awesome. So it just means you can, like, I spin up like little mini Laravel sites all the time just because to test, and it takes so little effort. You basically do a Laravel new. I use Postgres, so I do the old create DB, give it a name. So now I have a Postgres database. Update my environment variables to just post, to set that database configuration. Run the migrations, and I have a functioning app basically. So it's pretty sweet. So there's one other piece that I'm kind of realizing that I didn't really mention, kind of that was part of this whole journey, which I think is an interesting thing to mention. So the one thing that I was doing kind of as I was initially creating those before Inertia, and as I was creating those full view page components and just doing I was using turbo links to go from one page to the next. That was actually working okay. Like it wasn't terrible. It just, like using cloaking, I could make it look pretty good. But the one thing that actually pushed me to use to come up with the Inertia idea was what's the name of it is sorry, brain fart here. Go to my clients. Oh, code splitting. That's what I'm thinking. So what I realized is kind of when I started doing that, I realized that I would have a much, much larger client side JavaScript bundle, right? Because that's really the trade-off. You say, okay, I'm going to build everything in Vue, or I'm going to build everything in React. That's amazing because you get all the power of those wonderful frameworks. But now it's like you now need to deliver those assets to your users. So I thought, well, this was before the Inertia idea even hit me. I'm like, well, if I'm using turbo links and going from one page to the next, I'm like, let me try it out. Let me just enable code splitting. So in Laravel, we have this, I guess it would be similar to, we have this abstraction over Webpack, which is called Laravel Mix. And Laravel Mix makes it really, really easy to take all your CSS and your JavaScript and package it all up and kind of create a minified production ready bundle, right? I think it would be so. Is it called Webpacker maybe in Rails?
Yep. Yeah, we just got that recently. Yep.
Sweet. Okay, so we have the same idea in Laravel. It's super, super handy because you basically don't think about your Webpack file anymore. It kind of is just this really light abstraction layer. And I only mention that because Laravel Mix has the option, like just built in, it supports code splitting. So if you're using so the way, I won't get into too many of the details of how code splitting works, but basically it works by using dynamic imports. So the import syntax, by like you give it a dynamic page component name, and then when Webpack runs and whenever all that hoopla that gets run, I don't know all the stuff that gets run. Babel's involved in different things. So when that all gets run, basically what happens is it creates all your different page components and even any like utility files, any sort of JavaScript assets, right? It creates them not as one big bundle, but what it does is it creates a separate file for every single page. And then it has like one main file for like whatever the initial index is that you're landing on, right? So, or for like your vendor files. So what happens is in kind of a typical web app, you'll have like one bigger file that's going to include Vue or React, maybe some vendor libraries, but even the vendor libraries can be split out. It kind of includes whatever the minimal amount of JavaScript is required to kind of get that first page load to up and running. And then every other single page is its own file. And what happens then is the way it bundles it all up, Webpack kind of just takes care of this automatically for you. When you go and visit another page in the application, it automatically says, okay, I need this page component. That means I need to load this other JavaScript file. So that was like really, really what I wanted to have, because I didn't like the idea that, well, I can only use this whole approach until my JavaScript bundle gets too big, and then I'm just like practically not going to be able to use this anymore because I can't possibly ask someone to download a 2 megabyte file or whatever just to load my app. But what I experienced was with TurboLinks that it actually worked. So when I went to a new page, it would work. So TurboLinks would reload the next page, but the problem was TurboLinks would have that initial JavaScript file that was loaded, so the base one. But then when it went to load the new page and it displayed the HTML, it swapped it out, put the new HTML in, and in the root of that, obviously, it would have that page component, right? Then Webpack would figure out, well, actually, I need this other JavaScript file in order to even load this page. So what would happen is it would load the new page, and then it would wait there for a second while the browser downloaded the JavaScript file required for that page, and then it would display it. Are you guys tracking with me on that? It's a bit confusing. So, and I'm like, so it worked, meaning I could use code splitting, but it was just an awful experience for the user because they would go to a new page, it would sit there for a second, like, so that flicker got like 10 times worse, right? Because it would sit there for a second, load that file, parse that file, display the page component. And then I thought to myself, well, like, how do regular SPAs handle this? And the way that regular SPAs handle this is the loading of whatever that page component bundle, that JavaScript file, whatever, the loading of that new JavaScript file that's required for the next page, it's like included in the loading state of even the next page. So imagine in a regular SPA, you click to go to a new page. Client-side routing would happen, and what would happen is it's going to go off and load the bundle. It's going to go off and load. Code splitting is going to figure out, okay, well, we need this other JavaScript file. It's going to load it. It's going to show you some nice loading indicator, and then you're going to land there, and it's going to say, and then that page is going to load, and it's going to say, oh, we need data from the API, and we'll go off and get that. So you end up with almost like a two-step loading process, one where it gets the JavaScript files, and then the second one where it actually goes and gets the data from the API, or maybe it makes numerous requests to the API. And obviously, it only does that one time. Like once you have that component, it's cached and it's available in the browser. It's not going to re-download it every time. But it's a nice experience on an SPA because you don't lose the whole page. It's not like you click and the whole page disappears and you're sitting there with nothing there while things load and then it all shows up again. In an SPA, you click, it shows a loading indicator, you keep looking at whatever page you're on right now, and then when it's ready, then it jumps you to the next page. So that's why that works nice in an SPA. But in my situation, using TurboLinks, it was a really bad experience. So when I switched this, came up with this whole like, well, how really the thing that mattered was keeping that Vue instance alive. Because by keeping and not doing a full page reload and not rebooting all the HTML, rebooting all the JavaScript. So what would happen is, like, when I switched to Inertia, when you click on a link and it goes and makes an Inertia request to the server, and it says, okay, I gotta now, it comes back and says, okay, well, we're on this page now. Here's the page name and here's the page props, and it swaps them out. It doesn't like hide everything. It literally says, oh, I need to go and get this JavaScript asset. It loads the JavaScript asset, and which is normally quick, right? Because each page is its own file, so that's pretty fast. And then it already, this is the nice thing that's even nicer than an SPA. It doesn't then need to go off and make a separate request to the API to get whatever data, because it already has the data, because it already got it back from the server. So you basically click, makes the request to the server, comes back, knows what JavaScript file needs to load, loads that file, displays the component. And that all happens very fast, and it all happens without any flickers or anything, because nothing's being destroyed. It's just waiting until it's ready and then showing it. So that was like the whole code splitting thing was like a super, super key piece of all this, which I still think is like one of the neatest things about Inertia, is that it just works with code splitting like right away out of the gate.
That is really cool. I don't think I've set up code splitting in Webpacker and Rails yet, so that'll be an interesting one to try out, because you like want to make it as fast as possible on the first page view, and if you're downloading 2 megabytes of JavaScript, then it's going to be slow on mobile for sure. So that solves that in a really kind of elegant way, because it's like, here's what you need to get the Vue instance booted up and whatever you're looking at, the first page view. But you don't need any of the other stuff with that just yet. So that's cool. Do you have to use, like, I see in here in your docs, like the Inertia links? Do you have to use that for stuff to work?
Yes, you do. So that was a decision. That's a good question. So that was a decision. I guess technically you don't have to. So, but I had to make a decision early on. My original prototype of Inertia basically did what TurboLinks does. Anytime you click a link, it basically intercepts a link, tries to make an educated decision about whether or not it should follow that link like a normal link click, or to prevent default and handle it using an XHR request, right? So I'm like, that was kind of like my gut. That's what I wanted to do at first. But there's a lot of annoying edge cases with that I was worried that I would like not know if, and I'll give you a real simple example. Like if it's like an Inertia, in a TurboLinks app, if you click to view a PDF, well, you don't want TurboLinks to follow that as an XHR request, right? So you have to like put some sort of like flag on that link to say, TurboLinks disabled on this link, right?
Yeah.
So I decided early on, largely because I looked at the other popular routing libraries out there like React and Vue Router, and they didn't take they didn't take the blacklist approach. They took the whitelist approach, which I hummed and hawed and decided that I think that's the better way to do it. Now there's so to answer your question, if you want to create an SPA mode link within your application, you have to drop in what's called an Inertia link. And an Inertia link is literally just a wrapper around like a regular anchor link. That's all it is. And it just intercepts the click or the visit and does it using XHR instead of doing a full page reload. In addition to that, like TurboLinks has like turbolinks.visit, you can do the same thing with Inertia. So if you want to make like programmatic like visits, you can do that as well, which I find that you do end up doing that once in a while. So technically, if you really, really like the TurboLinks behavior, you could add a global event listener on all your anchor links and just intercept those and call inertia.visit. But I'm actually really happy with that decision, the decision to use Inertia links. It worked out. It's worked out great. And it's actually kind of neat because it's allowed some other interesting things. So I'll give you one real quick example, and I could probably I don't know how long you guys want to go. I could talk forever about this stuff, but let me just finish this. So one cool thing, like one thing that Laravel does is to log out. I don't know how it works in Rails, but when you log out of your application in Laravel, you actually have to log out using a post request. And the short reason why basically is to force CSFR or whatever that is, token verification, so that nobody can log you out of your own website somehow using some sort of cross-site scripting or anything like that, right?
Right.
So the way you log out and the way kind of Laravel comes built stock with kind of their default auth scaffolding, and they actually have, like, for the logout link, it's not an actual link. It's a tiny little form that's a post that makes action is method is post, and when you click on that, it basically intercepts that and it logs you out, kind of just using a post form submission, which is kind of, you end up with it's kind of this dirty little piece of code because you have like this form jammed in like to like a drop down menu or something, right? But with Inertia, it's way nicer. Like, and I actually have an example of this on the links page in the Inertia docs, and you can say Inertia link href equals /logout method equals post. So you can literally define methods right on your Inertia link. So if you want to make a post request or a put request or whatever, you can do that right on your link, which is really, really cool, actually. And the reason it can do that is because it's making an XHR request behind the scenes, which allows that, right? So
yeah, that's interesting because we in Rails kind of take that stuff for granted because we have this. There's a little JavaScript library called Rails.js, and it's unobtrusive JavaScript, so we can basically add like a method delete to our sign out links, and it will submit a delete request. And in the head tag, there's already the CSRF token, and so it can do that just kind of built into Rails, and that's like how forms get submitted with Ajax, and you don't have to write anything except for like a server-side JavaScript response and stuff. But it's really cool to basically create that exact same functionality in Inertia because you wouldn't necessarily need the Rails UJS stuff at all to do this, and it makes sense because you're already in Vue, right? Like, you
totally
don't need another thing there, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It also reminded me of, like, you were talking earlier about forms and the redirect and stuff. How are you handling like the errors that need to be sent back?
I think this is one of my favorite parts of the whole thing. Because forms are like, I joke that like most modern web applications are like 95% forms, right? Like at least the applications that I've built in my career, it's just one form after the next. It's just, this is my life. I build forms, which is fine.
This is like what made me reach for Vue over anything else originally, because it was like, well, I got to build this nasty form that like is probably a good candidate for like a wizard, but then selecting the right page when there's an error and all those things were just complicated. So having a front end library that can do a lot of that makes perfect sense for complex forms. So yeah,
man, I love building forms in Vue. I think that's probably the thing I enjoy using Vue for the most. And that's because like the way V model works under the hood, the way all the reactivity stuff works, I'm so fast. I sometimes get frustrated with kind of all the JavaScript hate out there. And don't get me wrong, I can hate on JavaScript just as well as the next person. But I think sometimes we take for granted how amazing some libraries like Vue and React are at doing some of this stuff, and forms in Vue are just, they're magical. They just work so nice. So I'll kind of walk you through how I handle forms in my applications, in my Inertia applications. So you go to a page, right, and it's got a form on it somewhere, and I build it just kind of like you would with Vue normally, and I have a submit event listener on the form that does a prevent default, right? So it doesn't do a full page reload like a normal HTML form would. And then I submit it. And what I do is in the submit handler, I basically just do inertia.post or put or whatever it is, right? Inertia.post. I give it the endpoint that I want to post to, so /users to create a user or whatever, right? And then I just say I give it the data, so whatever the form data is. So I'll often wrap up all my data into like a form object in Vue, just so I can say in that actual chunk of code, I can just say this.form, which is all the data that you want to submit down, right? So it's, again, there's an example on this under inertia.js.com/forms. And it's really simple and easy to understand. So what happens though, so that's like pretty straightforward. It's just like you would do with a normal Vue form, except if you were to submit it using XHR. So inertia.post is basically a way of making an AJAX request to an endpoint with some data. Okay. But what happens is, as I've said before, like when you hit that create user endpoint and the validation passes, it's going to redirect off somewhere and it's going to return a successful page, maybe your user index page, right? But the tricky thing is, what do you do when validation fails? And this is the cool piece. So what happens in Laravel, and I would imagine it would be the exact same thing in Rails, when you submit a form to an endpoint and your validation fails, Laravel automatically redirects you back to the page that you're on. So imagine you're on the create user page. You submit your form to the create user endpoint. The create user endpoint does some validation. That validation fails. It automatically redirects you back to the create user form, that page, with the errors available to you. Now, normally, if you're building a classic server-side application with no inertia involved at all, and you do this, you're going to hit submit. It's going to go make a post request to that endpoint and redirect back, and all your data is going to be gone from your form, right? So then you got to go through this process of repopulating that data. Is this making sense to you guys?
Yeah, and in Rails, it does work a little bit different because we will be on like project/new, and you'll submit, and then the create action will submit to like /projects, and that will actually return HTML in that response, which will be rendering the new page over again.
Yes.
Instead of a redirect. So
Gotcha.
that is interesting.
Okay, so this is a little bit different than that. So, and Laravel works a little bit different, but essentially what you end up with, I'll just talk kind of the way I work, and I would imagine you'd be able to work the exact same way in Rails, is when that validation fails server side and it redirects back to the page that you're on, and it provides the errors. What you can do, and the way I build my Inertia apps, is what happens is I set there's kind of this, you normally pass page props right in the controller method, right? So you say, okay, well, this is the user page and here's all the data, the props for that page, right? But you can also assign what are called, it's called global props, or like shared data that's accessible to all your page components. So what happens is when that validation fails and it redirects back to the page you're on, it passes the errors, an error bag basically of all the errors. And what I do is in my app, in kind of like a middleware sort of layer, is I actually automatically take the errors that are in the session and I pass them as shared props or shared data to Inertia. So if you think about this, what happens is you literally end up back on the same page, which means that you're on the create user page still, and the whole entire component doesn't reload, right? Because you're on the same page, so it doesn't swap out the component. But what it now has, because it has that new prop, which is the errors, and if you kind of know the way Vue and React work, anytime the props for a component change, it's reactive, right? So it'll automatically react. That component will re-render based on whatever new props it received. So this page, so the create user form, maybe you left the first name out or the name out, you're gonna submit it down, it's gonna redirect, it's gonna pass you the errors back to the same page that you're on, and those are gonna come through as props. And then within your actual template, you say if errors.user or whatever, you basically do a check, a conditional to see if there's an error for the name form and the email form and whatever forms you have, inputs you have. You basically do a check, and if there's an error, it displays it. So what happens is you submit it, they come back, you do nothing. You literally don't have to do any work, and your errors automatically display just like that. Just because that error prop was not populated when you first loaded the form, right? Because there was no errors. But now when you submitted it, it redirected back and it provided those props. Now the page updates, and you can do whatever you want. You can show a message at the very top of the page. You can add an error label to your inputs. You can show the error message below the inputs, whatever you want. And it's all just reactive. It all just works. And the other really key piece of this is you basically say, you can tell Inertia to not re-render the entire page component, which means that all your form inputs are like all exactly as they were. So it's not like they all reset to being empty, or if you're on the edit page, reset to being whatever it was initially when you visited that page. You're able to keep that local page component state exactly as it was by telling Inertia not to basically just hammer it and completely do a full reload. So that's like super, super, I find it's a bit of a difficult thing to explain kind of in this format, but if you try it out, it works really nice. And the end result is you don't have like a submit method in your view component that says inertia.post to the users in the form, and then you do a then call on it to catch whatever the response is and say, well, if there's errors, do this, and if it was success, do that. You don't have to do any of that. You literally just say inertia.post, and that's it. And the rest of it just kind of happens automatically. If it's a success, it does a redirect elsewhere. If it's a failure, it literally just reloads the exact same page you're on and with the error props. And when I say reload, like the request was made, but it's not like it's rebooting Vue or reloading that page component. It doesn't have to, because when Vue says, well, it's the same page component, it knows not to replace it.
That's cool. Sense? Yeah, I think so. Because in Rails you would have your, like, if it was successful, redirect, and if it wasn't successful, we like render the new page again. And just because we're in that request, we can keep all those variables or the data that you submitted and re-render it right into the form again. Yep. So it's kind of the exact same approach, just using JavaScript, which is really nice, because then you're not doing like if there are errors, then we need to go like add those to the page and whatever. It's kind of just, here you submitted it, there's errors now, it will re-render the exact same template with errors, and that's it.
And to be clear, correct me if I'm wrong, but with this approach, like with the Inertia approach, we're using the Vue form, a Vue like page component. Like when you do this, it's not only your data that's preserved, it's any other state that you have going on. For instance, you might have you might have like a scroll container somewhere on that page, or maybe you have tabs, or maybe you have some sort of other thing going on that page. And all of that stuff is preserved as well, which I would imagine, like even if you have like a certain input focused, it maintains that, which I'm assuming wouldn't.
No, like, of course not.
All of that stuff all gets preserved, which is such a nice user experience.
That's slick, because that's the like frustrating part if you're building a wizard, where it's like you're on the last page of that, you click submit, and then the whole thing kind of refreshes, and you're back to page one, and then there are errors, and then I got to click through all the tabs to figure out where the errors are. Like, you're going to preserve the state, which is really nice. Is there like a well, I guess like it's going to re-render, so you could use that callback to select the first page with the first error on it or something, if you wanted to like move the user to like, hey, this field was left empty or something in your wizard. But that would just kind of be like regular Vue code in that place.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, like I guess there's different ways you could build a wizard. Like you could build a wizard where each step of the process is actually its own endpoint and page component. That's like kind of one way of doing it. Probably the way I would do it is I'd probably build it as like a single view page component, but then pass through like a page or a step like key. So like step 1 or step 2, or maybe if they're named or whatever, and then that would automatically just be preserved. So you really wouldn't have to do any work there. That would just kind of just automatically just work for you.
That's cool. I love it. Jason, you have any more questions? I know we've been on for over an hour, so.
No, I think that about answers all of them. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us. And there's also, if you're curious, it's been mentioned, but there's a Rails adapter for Inertia. That's a Ruby gem. You can just go add to your Rails app and get started with it.
Yeah, I played with it just the other day, like 2 days ago, and it was pretty easy to get set up and everything. So I just need to go through and, build some forms and actually feel it out. But it's like really easy to set up, and it is, is kind of awesome feeling as it sounds, just because it's like, well, now you get Vue, but you don't have to deal with any of the weirdness that like turbo links or anything else that might cause for it. So that's awesome.
Yep. So there's some a few gentlemen that have been helping me with the Rails gem. I really feel like I know the Laravel one well because that's what I work with every day, and I kind of feel like I got to learn a bit more about Rails to kind of like make sure that it's the same sort of developer experience that I'm experiencing in Laravel, which is that's really the challenge for me with this library, because I'm being forced to learn lots of different languages and frameworks to kind of make this all work, because there's 3 different client-side frameworks or adapters, right, for Vue and React and Svelte. But then there's a Rails adapter and a Laravel adapter, and people are creating adapters for other things. There's a Cold Fusion adapter someone made. There is a Django adapter. And this is what's really cool about Inertia is like you can literally, it's not like just for one framework. It's like totally framework agnostic in that sense, at least definitely server-side framework agnostic. You can use it really with any server-side framework, any web server-side framework. There's no reason why you couldn't. So yeah.
It's just you need the glue code in between to make that talk the same protocol, and then you're good to go. Yeah, that'll be the big challenge of like, all the little nuances of the internals of how, like we talked about, like Rails form errors being rendered versus Laravel and Django and all those. Those are, I'm sure, a little bit tedious to do, but as long as you find someone who knows the framework pretty well, I bet it's not as bad. And it sounds like people are contributing these, for fun. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'd be curious if you guys were to try it to see how the handles the error stuff in Rails, because I probably should know, but I honestly don't. I should probably just go through the battle of getting it all set up one day and just kind of see what it feels like. Yeah. Oh, one quick other feature I'd love to mention before we wrap up is asset versioning. So one like really big challenge you run into with SPAs is, because the user isn't reloading the window, a user could be like have the assets that originally loaded, so all the JavaScript files or the CSS files or whatever. They could run into a situation where like they may have had the app open for 2 weeks, and you may have deployed new assets 20 times, but they're still on the old JavaScript assets. And this is like a non-issue with a classic server-side rendered app where it does full page reloads, because a lot of times you'll use like cache busting, some sort of URL, like a hash or something on the assets to force them to reload, right? So it's not an issue there. It's not an issue with TurboLinks either, right? Because TurboLinks will handle that automatically. But for SPAs, this is a nightmare. And if you go looking around when you're building like a classic Vue SPA and you try to figure out how people are handling this, they're using like web workers, I think they're called. People are doing like all sorts of different crazy things to try to figure out, are the assets out of date? Do we need to refresh the assets and kind of handle this whole thing? But the really cool thing with Inertia is because like there's this like really neat harmony between the server side adapters and the client side adapters. because it's all built by me or who's ever helping me with this. There's like some really neat opportunities that happen because of that we can do things that you wouldn't necessarily normally be able to do otherwise. And asset versioning is one of these things. So what happens is when you configure your app, kind of like in your your base, middleware, your base app configuration, you can say to Inertia what version of your what version your assets are currently at. And that doesn't have to be like, the version can be anything. It could be a number. It could be, for me, I just use a hash of my assets. So every time the page loads the first time, Inertia knows, or anytime any request happens, Inertia just says, okay, it's the hash of whatever my assets are. So if my assets ever change, the hash will change, and I know that I got to make a change. But the problem is when you make an Inertia request and the assets change, you're still stuck with this problem. Like, okay, I know that the assets have changed, but what do I do about it? And really what you want to do is you want to force a full page reload, right? So, but that's kind of a tricky thing, because imagine you're submitting a form and like and it figures that out, like, and then detects that the assets are out of date. What is it going to do? So the way Inertia works is, what happens is every part of kind of like the protocol, which includes the component name, which we talked about, the props, and the URL. There was actually a fourth one that I didn't mention, which is the version. So the client always has whatever the current version response was, whatever the latest version that came from the latest request back from the server, right? And then what happens is, if you make a request to any Inertia request, what happens is it passes that whatever it thinks is the current version. And then in the Inertia middleware, Inertia automatically compares what the version is client side to what it is server side. And if it changes, it basically just halts the request right there and returns, I think it's I get it wrong every time, but it's like some sort of like 409 or some sort of, invalid response. And then Inertia detects that response and automatically does a full page visit to whatever endpoint you were trying to hit. So you basically, what happens is, like, users are using your app, you deploy a new thing, Heroku deploys, whatever, the new assets are now live. A user goes and clicks another page in your app, makes an Inertia request. It detects that the assets are out of date, automatically stops that request, does a full page load to that request, and then just carries on like it back in SPA mode, all automatically for you. You literally don't have to think about this problem at all with Inertia. All you have to do is tell it the version, and Inertia takes care of the rest automatically for you.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool. And that handles like a form submission that was that hit a different version?
Yes, it does. And that's because there's this idea in Inertia of I forget the actual feature name, but there's basically a way to remember the state of that form in the and basically the history state. So it automatically will remember. Yeah. So
Okay,
that was like,
that makes sense.
that was kind of like the really tricky piece. I'm like, how am I going to do this? Yeah. It'll even remember, like, if you do something and it has to go and redirect elsewhere, it'll even remember like if you do like flash messages and stuff like that. So the Inertia middleware, at least in Laravel, it'll automatically reflash like errors or like messages or whatever, so that if it does that extra, it's basically doing a full extra request, right? Well, it's not a full extra request. The first one's cut short. So it literally doesn't even get into your application. It just says, can't go any farther. The assets are out of date. It reflashes any session variables and then just keeps going.
Oh, wow. That's cool. So I guess the push state stuff can take some extra metadata that you can use just to store that stuff in then?
You can put whatever you want into push state, which is really handy as well. I use that for different things. Yes, you can put whatever you want.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you gotta be a little bit careful, because the browsers do have like a limit on how much data you can put in there. But typically, it's not an issue at all. So we also use that. So here's the other thing, and we should probably wrap up because I can go on forever about this. But the other thing that happens is every time you make an Inertia page request and you're browsing through your app, when you hit back, it keeps a cached version of whatever, all the page component, the URL, and the props of the previous pages. So you hit back and it automatically just restores all those exactly as they were previously without it making a request again. And that's exactly how it does it, because it doesn't keep track of all the HTML like you normally would with the push state stuff. It literally just keeps track of the page component name and the props. And I just swap it out like it was a regular page visit, except it's a history navigation visit instead.
That's pretty creative. I like it. Yeah, you got me wanting to fiddle with Inertia as soon as I can. So I'm
Cool.
sure we'll be chatting about some Rails stuff and see if I can help improve docs or whatever for Rails. Wherever I can. So
cool.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on. Where can people find you? And
Inertia? So Inertia is Inertia.js.com. You will spell inertia wrong the first time you type it. It's impossible not to. I don't think I've met anybody who hasn't misspelled it the first time. That is,
unless you're a physicist.
Yeah, it can't be done. It's hilarious. I see it all over the place. That's the one downside of that name. But yeah, inertiajs.com for the library. And then you can find, I'm on Twitter. That's kind of my main place that I get involved in social media. So it's twitter.com/ my last name, Reinink, REININK.
Cool.
Great. Yeah, and we'll have links to all that in the show notes.
Awesome.
Well, Jonathan, thanks again. Hopefully we'll all be chatting again soon.
Cool. My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being on. Talk to you next week, Jason.
All right, we'll see you.